Okay, so my name is Tommy Heffernan, I'm a veterinary consultant, and I'm going to look at a recent presentation I gave, which kind of brought a lot of my ideas together. Um, there's a lot of concepts in it, but really I'm looking at biological approaches in modern agriculture and veterinary and their opportunity. And I suppose the question is this alternative thinking, or is it essential for us to think about these things as we go forward? I said to somebody recently, when you open the biological lid and look underneath and understand what's happening, it's very hard to kind of go back. But I've lots to learn, and these are just ideas. So I suppose what I'm going to try and cover in this is why biological principles are important to recognize, my own experience with farming systems, and research for potential for microbes. So I've done a lot of work in the microbial world, so I might be quite biased in that perspective, but in a 20-year career, I really think what I've seen is game-changing around animal health and these tools across different species. What am I currently seeing in the system? And I'm going to challenge some of that thinking, but also there should be seen to be significant opportunities as well. What I certainly don't want to do is start putting one system against another and creating more debate and, oh, I told you so, or this is wrong and that's wrong. I think if we're going to look at change, it can be a difficult thing to do. And we have to recognize where we've come from, where we are. And this is just about ideas. And I've been very lucky to listen and I suppose watch other people's ideas and thinking and try and pull it together. And the next decade's a really important decade for agriculture. And I think we want to change everything right now, but we overestimate what we can do in a year and underestimate what we can do in a decade. And if we look at population growth, climate change, and all the challenges, it's well recognized that the next decade is probably one of the most important decades in agriculture. But that is also a very exciting thing, I think. So why can a vet try and think so broadly about maybe many of the concepts I have here? Well, my own experience as a vet in practice was I was started off very focused on treatments for individual sick animals and looking at cures. And then I got fascinated by how we can prevent these and the interlinked, I suppose, causation around some of the diseases I was seeing. And then I began to understand the biological, I suppose, interlinked nature of disease on farm and the whole farming system. Since sort of leaving that clinical practice setting, I've got really fascinated by food production systems and their interlinked nature into our biology, our ecosystems, our planet, human health. And I've done a lot of reading and trying to understand this, but it's about trying to look away, and I've always tried to get better at this, looking outside the system and looking at how complex they can be, and trying to figure out solutions, potential solutions. So this is just about ideas, some of the things I've learned, obviously some of the research I'm involved in, some of my own biases around microbes, but I think it's quite interesting when you look at the whole system and look at the next decade at the potential challenges and opportunities that are there. So let's start with the end in mind, particularly in animal agriculture, and we're producing animal protein. There's been a lot of debate around animal protein, but from what I've researched and seen, animal protein is actually a really important macronutrient in the human diet. And there's a huge amount of debate on animal agriculture, and yes, we have significant challenges, but some of the narratives that have been created around animal agriculture are sort of misleading and challenging and not looking at that bigger long-term picture, as hopefully I'll make a case for it. I really want to understand that animal protein has a really important role to play in the human diet. It can be produced in a way that is at one with our ecosystems, and of course, depending on the intensity, there's always trade-offs. And I think that's okay. Trying to bring everybody with you is next to near impossible, but I'm trying to hit a middle ground of people who are just open to ideas and thinking of maybe what will the next decade look like. So I'm going to challenge the status quo a little bit, and I'm going to look at our biome and our health. So we know climate change, it's been well recognized as our biggest challenge going forward, not just for agriculture, but for, I suppose, humanity in general. And we've lots of indicators there that our our planet is under pressure. And because animal agriculture has a role to play in climate change, like every industry, some people will really put it as one of the leading causes, and then on the other side, people say that it's essential and that we don't need to worry about these things. And I'm somewhere in the middle, that we, of course, have achieved so much, but we need to look at what agriculture looks like over the coming decades. And I think it's interesting for me that some of the solutions are this idea of synthetic biology, synthetic meat. But instead of synthetic biology, why not optimize the biology that we already have? And to do that, we've got to look at probably soil health and the role soil health plays in animal health, as I'll talk about as I go along. And then looking at animal health in the whole sphere of human health, both from a dietary perspective and its impact on our ecosystems. But I think there's a huge opportunity here. And my own opinion from looking at this for a while is it's not synthetic biology, but optimizing the biology we already have. So before we go forward with agriculture, we've got to look back, and so many people give out about agricultural systems and what they've done or what they're doing, but actually in fact our agricultural systems in my opinion are quite good, and they can be great. And it's this idea that we achieved so much since probably post World War II with the Green Revolution, the likes of Norman Borlaug. We've seen a massive increase of global food production at a time when population growth was growing. We've actually seen agricultural land go down, so we have achieved a lot. So we've created great efficiency, we've created cheap food, and like everything, at a point in time, we could need to pivot. But it's not dismissing everything we have achieved, because I think if you look globally, what agriculture has done has been quite phenomenal. But there is points in time where you look at things and say, well, are we now fit for purpose? Do we need a shift? And my own opinion from what I've seen is a shift back towards biology. Now, food systems are incredibly complex, where you look at it maybe between developed countries and developing countries. But I'm a believer in human ingenuity, and certainly within all systems there's trade-offs, and the recognition for communication and good conversations, and not tit for tat. And I don't want this to be about tit for tat, but just maybe about ideas. We've certainly seen the role of chemistry and how it's played a significant role in the increase in global food production, but it has also created challenges. If we look at the abundance of food, and particularly as I try and research human diet and human health, some unintended consequences, particularly I would say from ultra-processed food, calorie-rich food, and we've got a lot of metabolic health challenges. Even if we look at global food production now from the context of population, of how much food we produce versus how much food is actually wasted, 30% of food can be wasted in developing countries, and that's a challenge. Before we talk about massive shifts to synthetic biology, let's look at the food we're producing currently and look at areas like food waste. And then we have the huge challenge in developing countries around starvation and just human nutrition and health, and actually the availability of food. So I think we've achieved so much, but it's a time for, I suppose, looking at where we're going for the next decade, not getting caught up in ideologies, but looking at as much science as we can, looking at the challenges in front of us and trying to put pieces of this jigsaw together. So for the purposes of this I was going to say debate, it's not necessarily a debate when you're talking to yourself, but looking at, I suppose, the purposes of this presentation and trying to see what I've learned and trying keeping the principles as simple as possible. Microbes and microbial life and beneficial bacteria have been a huge part of my career for the last 2 years. I think they're massive potential, and I'll look at soil, animal health, and even delve into the human world, but particularly I've seen biological optimization for a better future, and I'm going to use the story of sponges. It's going to have obviously a heavy influence on microbes and their potential, but there's lots of things I've learned over my career that I'm going to talk about, and I think that's interesting from my perspective as well. I've made loads of mistakes, so I'm an incredibly flawed human being, so I come at this from the perspective that change is challenging at an individual level. At a collective level, it gets even more difficult. But it is about having good conversations, and personally it's always about self-awareness. Where can I get better? And that's this awareness now around where is agriculture and where's the opportunities would be a key element to this. But a story of sponges for simplicity. So if I'm going to talk about microorganisms and microbes, here's some definitions. So microorganisms are tiny organisms living in all kinds of environments, so viruses, bacteria, protozoa, and fungi. And we often think about microorganisms in a negative fashion in the way of pathogens, but they have huge potential also from a health perspective. When we understand microorganisms' role, we can talk about the soil microbiota, the gut microbiota, the skin, the lung, and that's where we have a community of microorganisms in a specific environment. It's just nomenclature. What gets interesting when we look at microbes is when they're in a certain area, like the gut microbiome, and their collective ability to act almost like another organ. So their synergistic relationship in that local environment. And that's really interesting when you look at the soil microbiome, the gut microbiome, and other microbiomes in both human and animal in different parts of our anatomy, if we like. So just by way of definitions. So to talk about, I suppose, microbiota or microbiomes collectively, I'll use these animations throughout my presentation. So what interesting for me, someone who's looking and trying to get answers and where is the future of food, as I step outside my role as a clinical vet on farm to look at kind of farming systems and the future of agriculture and food, is one thing that's really interesting that I've learned over the last 2 years with some of the research I've been doing, is the role of actual microbes in our planet and all around us. Microbial life is key to soil health, and it's probably where a lot of challenges can start and solutions can begin, if you like. But at a root level in soils, microbes are really important. As vets, farmers and everybody, we know we're feeding, not so much feeding our ruminant livestock, but we're actually feeding the microbial billions and billions of bacteria in the ruminant intestines that are breaking down and digesting cellulose and hemicellulose and turning it into nutritious human food. When you look at the human microbiome story, it's really topical. One of the most exciting areas of human medicine is the human gut microbiome. It's linked to brain health, to overall well-being and health, and maybe a deterioration in the gut microbiome being certainly linked to chronic disease issues. So microbes are all around us, beneficial bacteria are all around us, and they have huge potential, I believe. Now, from an animal health perspective, we often talk about, and a human health perspective, we talk about this idea of one health. So animals, humans, our planetary ecosystems, we're all in this one environment sharing it together. And there's often a focus very heavily here on the need to reduce pathogens. And we know that infectious diseases, 70% of human infectious diseases have a zoonotic or animal origin. So we need to be very careful about understanding these ecosystems and reducing that infection pressure. But if you actually look at infectious disease, particularly in developing countries, it's in decline for a number of years, and there's lots of reasons for that. We've seen the development of antibiotics, vaccination, principles of hygiene, and they've all led to reduction of infectious disease. What's been really interesting, and probably during our global pandemic we saw this, we've seen a massive increase in non-communicable chronic disease. So chronic disease is on the increase in developed countries. So I think there's an opportunity about understanding, okay, we're seeing a reduction in infectious diseases, but what about harnessing biology and nature to understand potentially how we can reduce chronic disease, particularly linking animal agriculture, soil health, animal agriculture, all the way to human health. So if you were talking about this particular subject maybe 10 or 15 years ago, it would have been seen as very alternative. But there's been changes in the science that have allowed us to make rapid developments. And I think metagenomics is one, and this is our ability to use ssRNA sequencing to understand the different bacteria in our guts, in our soil. And we now understand a lot more about the diversity of microbial life, and metagenomics is really a good way of that, building pieces of that jigsaw. What I think is going to be a game changer around harnessing the potential of nature is metabolomics. And this is allowing us to understand what metabolites these bacteria are producing, and a very interlinked understanding of how, even at a cellular level, these metabolites are working. And because we can harness that, and I've been involved in projects that have been doing that. So we've seen recent research on the cow side looking at the role of postbiotics. So postbiotics are the metabolites that bacteria produce. We've seen that in a recent paper from Chagas looking at postbiotics in the mammary gland. I've been very actively involved in the digestive health space across animal species, looking at the role of postbiotics in gut health. And at a cellular level, these metabolites that bacteria produce, as I'll explain as I go along, are actually key to cellular integrity, function, and they carry out the actions of these bacteria. The bacteria themselves are like factories. So why this is quite interesting is because we now know, if we look at the human gut, if we look at the soil microbiome, we look at rumen health, we can know through metagenomics the different bacteria that are there, the different families and species. But now through metabolomics, we're actually understanding what they're producing. We're understanding how these interactions are occurring. And that's why there's a huge opportunity to look at maybe harnessing this. We've seen how chemistry has helped modern agriculture develop, but now we can potentially look at metabolomics and harnessing maybe some biological solutions in a much more structured way as we look at global population increasing and that need to increase food production, but also by having a more harmonious relation with the ecosystems in which we produce food from. So like everything, the microbiome is a hype cycle where there's visibility, and I think ssRNA sequencing was probably that trigger. And sometimes it's a peak of inflated expectations. So hopefully today in this presentation, I'm coming to you in the slope of enlightenment. Some people would say I perpetually live in the slope of enlightenment or self-enlightenment. But it is really important to look at the hype cycle and the potential of anything. And I will go back time and time again to my concept, which I developed many years ago in practice, is being brilliant at the basics. Doing the simple things well is still the key to maybe animal health and good animal health. Okay, so if we take a jump back out from maybe animal agriculture and we look at this idea of diversity, and I think that is an important conversation when we look at currently where we are. And it's really interesting to look at maybe infectious disease declining in developed countries and this certain massive increase in metabolic disease and chronic disease we're seeing in developed countries. And one area that's of particular interest is actually the human gut microbiome. So if you look here, this is metagenomics basically, and if we look here, we're looking at the bacterial species and traditional lifestyle populations, and if we compare them to the significant shift, so there's been a shift, a change in the gut microbiota in developed countries. We can also see somewhat of a narrowing. And if we think about how important the gut microbiome is centrally to health and our digestive systems, well, there's a strong argument for why we're seeing a lot of potential chronic diseases in developed countries on the increase. And there's a number of factors involved. Diet being the number one, and I've tried to do a lot of reading on a very complex area, and everyone will have a different opinion, and there's a paper almost now to support every argument. But one consistent thing is the rise of ultra-processed foods, and I think that is a significant challenge. You know, modern lifestyle has created excess stress. There is a potential for toxins. So if we look at some of the chemistry we're using in agriculture, there's some strong papers suggest, particularly when we look at insecticides and pesticides, have they had a potential role in the changing gut microbiota? And they're not just used in animal agriculture, they're used in cropping agriculture as well. The environments we live in and our lifestyles create challenges as well. So it's been recognized that this is an area of interest, and diversity of the gut microbiome, diversity of microbiota in our gut is a positive thing. So that's an area of human research. But if you look at the role of microbes in soil, and I think it's really interesting as well when we look at the challenge of desertification. So if we, particularly in developing countries, and this is going to be an increasing challenge when we look at climate change, that when we look at soil health and the challenges there, well then diversity is also key. And if we think about, and I'll talk about some of the principles of where, you know, not just for maybe from an Irish context, but also from a global context in developing countries, the role of cattle and livestock and diversity of crops in improving soil health. Well, this is a huge opportunity for us to think about our biological systems going forward and the role of animal agriculture within particularly developing countries. I've been involved across species now for the last 18 months looking at gut health and gut health solutions, and it's been mind-blowing the results that we've seen. But you can see across most species, whether it be wild horses, zoological horses or domesticated horses, the same shift and narrowing in the gut microbiota in different research papers. So it is recognized that the diversity of the gut microbiome is important. And if we look at how we can harness that through maybe diet and other factors, be it in humans, in animals as well, looking at that diet. And also I'm obviously involved in that space where we understand more about it and we can use metabolomics to help with those challenges. And realizing that there's always trade-offs when we go from wild to domestication, and the needs for that domesticated animals be it for food production, for lifestyle animals, or pets, or whatever animals that are around us in our systems and our planet. It's important to recognize that there's always trade-offs. So I think that's where microbes come in with a beneficial role. But at the base of it, the concept today is understanding that we do need to look at the patterns within nature and see how they're shifting and see why they're shifting. So promoting diversity. So we know that there's value in what's happening in nature. The fantastic thing about nature is it's been here before us. It's created incredible systems to survive, and if we don't look after it, it will be here long after us. And we've seen that it can regenerate. And again, it's important to recognize that there's trade-offs when we need to produce more food and more intensive systems. So I don't think agriculture or farms are going to get smaller, they're going to get bigger, and they're large commercial entities, and labor is a challenge. So I'm a believer that farming systems are actually going to get larger, going to get more intense to a degree, but we can harness biological principles within these bigger farming systems. And you know, I'm all for people growing their own food and all that sort of stuff, but we have to recognize the need. If population growth continues, we need to recognize that food needs to be produced, and there's always trade-offs there. And I think we can harness biological principles in different systems, and we must take a wide view of the system and understand all the complexities. And as I said, it's so hard to bring everybody with you. So I'm trying to hit a middle ground of people who are open to listening to maybe asking questions why. And my why questions have come from trying to understand what I was seeing at a farm level on ground, and listening to all the different voices and dissension around agriculture, and trying to make sense of what would a path to the future look like. I think it all begins in soil, and I'm no expert in soil health, but it's really fascinating when you look at the fungal and microbial networks underneath our soil, and how important they are at so many levels, from plant nutrition, but at an ecological level. Microbial life, if this is like a pyramid, and again I'm robbing the ideas of so many people, and I saw this someone shared this online. I thought it was brilliant. The house of cards, that microbial life is sort of the foundation, and soil microbial life is the foundation of our planetary ecosystems. And that really, a lot of the things I saw as a vet in practice and over the last couple of years actually brought me back to soil, and understanding that soil health can be the basis of all our ecosystems because of its ability for water retention, its ability to actually sequester carbon, the value of good soil health in plant health. And if we think about microbial life being involved in mineral nutrition and at the root of plants and plant health, that if we can get that right while we're growing plants for animals or plants for human consumption that are going to be healthier, that it all begins in soil. And if we pick something as simple, and I suppose that's the first introduction to the healthy sponge idea, that soil is where it all begins from. And there's more and more conversations around soil health being the really, really fundamental to, I suppose, animal health and human health in the future. If we pick something on the pyramid as simple as the worm, it's a biological indicator species, as I would look at it, and I'll give you a case in point of some of the research that's been done in UCD around mixed species swards and what they're seeing with worm counts. But the worm, again, is part of this pyramid, and it's not a big job to dig a hole and actually start doing worm counts on farm, and looking at this as a real indicator species for good microbial activity. And if we look at that feeding chain up along, all these species are completely interlinked. So the key message would be that microbial life is at the base of our pyramid, of our food and ecosystems, and we can't ignore it. So in grazing systems, we talk a lot about pasture, we talk a lot about the leaf tissue above the ground. But what's really interesting when you look at the soil and as opposed to pasture, I mean, everything comes from soil. And if we think about the plant itself, if we went back 30 years ago, the energy it exuded through its root was thought to be wasted energy. Now the plant exudes up to 30% of its energy through the root, and it does this incredibly purposely to feed that microbial life in soil. And if we get this right, and we look at the potential for diversity of plants and diversity of root length, particularly when we look at that synergistic relationship with plants and soil health, the varying root lengths, bringing different levels of energy into different areas, and the potential to pull nutrition and also provide nutrition for soil, well, it makes complete sense that we'd focus more on soil. Again, even if we look at fiber, and I'll talk about this, the diversity of plants that we consume as humans is good for our gut microbiome, but also for animals. If we think about the microbial functioning within their digestive tract, diversity is good. And we're sort of a bit linear at the moment when we look at soil health, and I think this will advance over time, but NPs and Ks, something as simple as the worm, as I said, as a biological indicator within soil, it's something we must potentially, even as farmers, harness more and more, getting a shovel out and looking at worm count and asking why, particularly when we see more of the issues that I'm going to talk about later on. And then this brings in the challenge of particularly monocultures, where we have one type of plant, a shorter root, and the challenges that will bring for soil health long term. So if we look above the ground, equally there's indicator species like the dung beetle. A very good friend of mine, Bruce Thompson, did an incredibly important Nuffield on this topic, and he's worth looking up online. And again, another indicator species in this pyramid of nutrient recycling and the different types of species. And again, just understanding how our ecological system works. And the recognition that chemistry, particularly maybe our ivermectins or our pyrethroids, have been very useful for parasite control, but they have unintended consequences as well around maybe their impact on dung beetles. And it's not about completely moving from biochemistry to biology in the morning. It's about listening and looking and seeing what's happening and having questions about how can we enhance the biology of our farms, and ask the questions about our current chemical methods and weighing up the risks around them. So this is about conversations, but it's really interesting when you look at soil health, you look at the ecosystem, and this is an important conversation, not just from planetary health, but if we want to be in business and farming in a decade or 20 years time, we have to recognize that these are indicators of challenges that are there, and we need, if we act now and we act quicker, well, and focus more on this biological approaches, I think it'll be to benefit from a commercial and profitability perspective as well. So I'm not going to go through the photosynthesis and how plants work, but it is that understanding that the plant exudes 30% of its energy through the root, purposely feeding the soil microbiology. And then we can understand, well, if this is something the plant does, well, then root diversity and diversity of root lengths and diversity of crops makes a huge amount of sense. I think if you get into regenerative agriculture, and I'm not an expert in it, there's some very interesting principles around zero-till, particularly the utilization of cover crops to keep roots in the ground for longer. And actually cattle and ruminant livestock in rotation in these systems are absolutely key to maintaining soil health. And this is where I get a little bit upset, is the word maybe, that people think that we can have systems without ruminants, particularly going forward in food production systems, when actually if we understand the ecological principles of cattle and how we can harness that, they have a huge potential role in our ecosystems, but also if we think of the byproduct of that when we consume animal protein, a healthy, nutritious, important part of our macronutrient from our diet. I think it's about having a real big picture thinking, which sometimes can be absent in some of the conversations around animal agriculture. So the big question is, how can we increase, even maintain microbial life in soil? And, are there current practices that we're using that are actually decreasing it? So I think that's a really important message. I just want people to start thinking about soil health. If you're a farmer and you disagree with everything I'm saying, but maybe just start reading about soil health, listen to proper experts in the area, and open our minds to this area of soil health, because it's really, really important. So microbial life in soil. Soil biology, just to give people an idea of how much microbial life is in a teaspoon of soil. There's as much microbial life in a teaspoon of soil as there is people on the planet. So let's think about that from a numbers perspective, and how important it is to maintain that microbial life. So we always think about microbial life maybe from a pathogen perspective, and I certainly did as a younger vet. But now I can see the value of beneficial microbes and beneficial bacteria in a synergistic relationship with all parts of our ecosystem. And actually cattle in a rotational grazing system are actually key to maintaining microbial life. And that's an important message as well. It's really interesting when you look at the regenerative agriculture movement, and I don't want to create conventional versus regenerative versus organic. I think we just have to think about these principles and understand. A very interesting TED talk, a lot of people would have heard Alan Savory and others talking about cattle's role in the future of planetary health and their key role in that. It's really interesting when you look at what they're talking about. They think about the wild herbivore like our bison or buffalo, a herd species grazing together and their movement patterns. They were doing it to protect themselves from predatory species, but they are also, in that mechanism, are really helping with soil health. And it is slightly different. So when people talk about regenerative grazing, it is slightly different to our grazing systems we currently adopt because of the diversity of plants and the different types of style of grazing. And there's certain people adopting this with good results. And it's something we need to think about, particularly when we see the need to reduce nitrogen and the potential maybe for this of just harnessing biology. But like any change, I don't think we're going to do it tomorrow, but it's something we need to think about over the next decade. Where this type of approach becomes really interesting in the developing countries where agroecological systems are under huge pressure from climate change. And the work from Savory, the Savory Institute, has shown that they can reduce desertification, they can actually build carbon, drought resilience and improve soil health by harnessing and mimicking nature. And I think this is really fascinating when you look at the potential for I suppose our ruminant livestock in developing countries, and when we look at some of the narratives that are created around cattle and how harmful they are, I think people aren't looking at the big picture, certainly from a developing perspective and developing world perspective, on the role of cattle and ruminants in the health of our planets. So what about microbes inside of us? Well, I think most people involved in farming will understand that microbes, if you look inside the rumen, it's a large fermentation vat. Quite an incredible, ruminants are quite incredible. They can take undigestible inputs for humans and convert them into high quality animal proteins. And it's not the ruminant doing it, it's actually the microbial life within the rumen and digestive system that's doing that. Microbes inside animals, inside our cells, the importance of the gut microbiome, the gut-brain connection. 70% of our immune system's in our gut. Like none of us would be here without some innate defenses. Good bacteria, beneficial bacteria in our gut protect us against harmful pathogens. So microbes are absolutely key, and for the last 2 years, the work I've been doing has sort of been a massive piece in the jigsaw of understanding, what some of the potential challenges are, but the opportunities are for agriculture in the future. And several of people have said to me in the last 12 months, wow, you've gone full on the microbes. Well, I think it's some of the most game-changing stuff I've seen in my 20-year career. So microbes have huge potential, and through metabolomics now we're understanding what that potential is. So beneficial microbes in our digestive system, it's important to understand in a healthy gut that our digestive system in animals and humans is this huge surface area. So that's why 70% of our immune system is there. And beneficial bacteria are playing a key role interacting. So the gut microbiome is like, it's been recognized now as like another organ. They're interacting at a cellular level to maintain good gut health, to involve in digestive health, immunity, and they're competing with harmful pathogens. So our gut and our animal's gut that's the next idea of the healthy sponge. They talk about eubiosis. They do this by the production of metabolites that I'll talk about in a little bit, these postbiotic metabolites, and that's what helps regulate it. It gets really interesting when we look at dysbiosis and the unhealthy sponge and leaky gut. So when you have an altered or a damaged gut microbiota, we're going to see much more inflammation in the digestive tract, and we saw the shift in the gut microbiota at a global level. Well, then you can see why we need to think about sponges, and we need to think about digestive health, and we need to think about the interaction with microbes and this whole interlinked nature of our system. And also if we think about the production of these postbiotics and how they can be harnessed to, I suppose, from a biological approaches to repair, and I've seen that how beneficial these are because they help biological stabilization. So we can use beneficial microbes and their metabolites, pro and postbiotics, to actually help with leaky gut. And I've seen that across species with the various products that I've been involved in research. It's just fascinating. So beneficial microorganisms play a key role in digestive health. So the gut microbiome is really important, no matter what animal species, be it humans or whatever it might be. There's trillions of microbes working like an organ, and they're key to digestive health, the breakdown, the production of enzymes, and the breakdown and digestion of our food, immune function, as I'll talk about, and this idea that good bacteria, good and bad, good bacteria compete with harmful pathogens. So again, same thing, and I'm going to focus now on calves because this is sort of focused on livestock. But what does the gut microbiome and what does it do? It's involved in these three core functions. So we have good bacteria producing metabolites that can maintain a healthy microbiome, and a depleted microbiome creates huge challenges. 70% of our immunity is gut based, a little bit more actually, and this is the gut associated lymphoid tissue. These are all the white blood cells that are necessary to be there because it's such a massive surface area. If we also think about even all those white blood cells that are there, they still don't have the capacity to actually do all the, I suppose, what's the word? They don't have the capacity to actually pick up all of the potential infections and disruptions that are occurring. So they're actually, the gut and the immune system are linked, because the microbes in the gut and the immune system are linked, because they're an early signaling system, because we have trillions of them in the digestive tract. Fascinating when you look at the gut and the gut immune system and their relationship. And again, the gut microbiome, it's not just gut related. We've got a gut-lung axis. It's really important from a respiratory disease perspective. We've got a gut-mammary axis and a really important gut-brain axis. And this has been recognized as a really important area, that some of our neurotransmitters and hormones are actually produced in the gut, and there's a direct relationship with dietary and gut health and brain health. And this whole area of psychobiotics is really interesting. Again, there's a gut-skin interaction, or gut microbiome skin connectedness there. So fascinating when you look at all these connections that these bacteria, beneficial bacteria, play inside the gut around the body. Okay, so how do we develop our gut microbiome? And I'm going to pick calves as an example, but most mammals are the same. We're born, we're in utero, we're a fairly sterile environment. Through vaginal delivery, we'll pick up vaginal microbes from our mothers. Calves are the same, and fecal microbiota through the birthing process. And then that develops through feeding and other factors. So this is an area I've been heavily involved with in the research area, and actually really make a difference on farm as well. So the gut microbiome in calves, and this is the same for a lot of species, it actually starts with colostrum, the first milk. So colostrum has a lot of prebiotics in it. We know that these prebiotics are seeding and helping develop that young gut, and we know the importance of epigenetics for future development. And then feeding is really important, the early born life, feeding some, I would be a fan of higher levels of feeding, particularly if you look at the biological principles of feeding calves in natural, in grazing suckler calves. If we look at how much of that we can mimic, it's important. So the value of animal protein. I have 5 kids, and I love seeing them drink milk because it's full of quality amino acids. It's going to help skeletal development. So we need to be mindful of that as well in farming when we're talking about maybe weaning calves really early, trying to get them on to concentrate diets, when actually as monogastrics, young monogastrics, there's huge value in the quality amino acids they get from feeding, and I think it's hugely important. The quality of that feed, be it milk replacer or whole milk. But it's interesting if we're talking about weaning calves very early on to animal or plant proteins, and we were talking then about the value of animal proteins in the human diet, which I'll make a real case for as I go along. Again, there's other things that will affect the gut microbiome in calves, like hygiene, space, comfort, and all those stresses. And I think this is where I've been fascinated to see direct-fed microbials potential here, because it is always about trade-offs. We need to produce more food, so our systems are more intense. And defining intense is an argument for another day. But when you have biological norms and you change them, you create intensity, and that's a trade-off we'll always have when we're trying to produce more food. And I think it's a realistic trade-off we need. So then we need to look at, and we've seen in animal agriculture, the role of maybe antibiotics earlier on, vaccines and other products to help in that system, to help with immunity and cope with maybe increased infection pressure at certain times. Direct-fed microbials also have a huge potential role. So I've been involved with biological solutions for the last 2 years, and I think their potential role is huge. So just to talk about animal welfare, and this is something when I did my Nuffield in 2018, I traveled to 16 countries around the world, and one of the things that I became very aware of was the perceptions of animal agriculture. Some right perceptions, but some really off the wall stuff around what we were doing. And some of the issues consumers are most worried about from a dairy perspective are cow-calf separation. There's a real debate around indoors versus outdoors. And I think for another day, this discussion around animal welfare, but it's been evolving. We've achieved a lot and we've a lot more to do. And I think the concept of a life worth living is really important, that we value animals within the system. If we value animal protein as a really important macronutrient, which it is, we have to value all the animals in the different systems that produce that. And again, as a vet, the reality for me is quite different to maybe the consumers. As somebody who's has been working out on a farm for many years, I'm more worried about lameness, disease, and trying to keep biological norms versus these efficiency we're trying to create, that we are mindful of biological and behavior optimization. So when I did my Nuffield, I looked at something that I probably had from cow signals, and something I was interested in anyway was actually really understanding animals in farming systems. So I talked about systems thinking at the start. So what do animals want from the system? If you look at the cow, this is part of a diagram I created for my Nuffield. It's just understanding more about the cow's wants and needs, because you can build a better system around her. She's still a food-producing animal, and it's not about wrapping animals in cotton wool, but it's actually about understanding their biological needs, because that optimizes performance and output, reduces disease, reduces antibiotics, and creates better sustainability and efficiency in the overall farm system. Again, if we look at more biological optimization for calves, I'm going to talk about how we can use direct-fed microbials, but I still think more milk, more straw, more space, more fresh air. Again, understanding what would the calf want in nature and getting more of that into the system with happier, healthier calves that are going to thrive better, perform better, and have better future lifetime potential. Now, I shouldn't be talking about this, but again, it's about linking all this simple thinking as well. If we think about biological optimization for ourselves, I read a lot about human performance, and there's some very simple principles that are often hard to adopt, like sleep, movement, reduction of stress. Stress is our big challenge now, and diet. And if you look at the impact of that optimization for our gut microbiomes, I think sleep is good, exercise is good, and diet. I've read extensively on diet with a paper to support every argument from carnivore to veganism. I think it's just about balance, and I think the real enemy here, as I'll hopefully make a case for, is the need to reduce ultra-processed foods. And stress is a big one for humans as well. So animals and humans are no different. Stress has a massive impact on our immune systems, and our gut microbiome, and our overall behavior. So I have learned as part of, I suppose, as a vet, that I've got quite interested in psychology and behavior, because it's how we really impact change. So when you're bringing new ideas to the table, like some of the ideas I'm going to talk about today, you do challenge the status quo, you make people uncomfortable, and we all have fears. Like my fear would have been maybe 2 years ago to be talking about stuff like this, to be rocking the boat, and to maybe take some criticism for it. But I think once you get beyond that, human potential is massive. So a little bit on human biological optimization. So let's go back to our current systems, and I'm probably a long time getting to this, but I tried to jam this into a 35-minute webinar recently, and I said I didn't do it justice. So today is about recording a more extensive, long version of it for people who want to have a look at some of my thoughts and trying to put all this complex systems together and ideas. So I have been challenged by some of the current things I'm seeing within our grazing systems. And I still think there's huge opportunities here, but I always ask the question why, and pardon the pun, as you'll see, getting to the root cause, and I think that's important when we look at all of our systemic challenges in society and planetary. Root cause is important. So if I look at some of the things that I call iceberg diseases within our grazing system, that have made me ask questions, it actually brought me all the way back to soil. Pica, cows eating stones, I've seen that increasing. CCN, B1 deficiency in calves, I've even heard of it in cows now. Coccidiosis in adult cattle. Summer scar syndrome, any farmers listen to this would have heard me talk about that for a number of years. Mineral deficiencies, I think I've seen an increase in mineral deficiencies where I've been looking at it. Challenges like parasites, and some of the other ones there that I haven't mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about again. But these are all diseases that I've seen increasing, and I'm always asking the question why. And if I pick cows eating stones, it's an interesting one because it's funny. I saw my first real case of this 12, 13 years ago on farm. And again, I was looking at the causes of it can be low fiber, low sodium, or low phosphorus. And I wasn't never happy with the answer I was getting on farm, and particularly got a bit more frustrated when I saw that phosphorus was high in the soil and low in bloods and animals. What was happening? And it was actually, again, I've made the work from many people. It was Christine Jones was talking about the phosphorus paradox, and actually understanding and this is interesting from an animal perspective and also from maybe a crop perspective when we look at plant-based being the future, that okay, we need to understand that microbial life within the soil and root structure is actually key to the absorption of nutrients and minerals in the plant. That's important for the animal grazing them, but if we're looking at plants themselves, well, it would make a lot of sense that we need to focus on soil health for plant health that we will subsequently consume. So plants get minerals from soil through passive and active transport. It can be dependent on pH, but microbial life plays a key role. So there we have another microbiome, the soil microbiome, being involved in nutrition, immunity, and competitive inhibition. Really interesting. So because we're seeing more cows eating stones, we're looking at using maybe phosphorus as a finite resource. I think it's, again, an indicator we need to go back and focus on soil biology and look at the potential for maybe increasing soil microbiology and diversity. And I think that's a key message. And how do we do that? Well, we can do it with the diversity of plants that we were grazing our livestock on, because that creates a diversity of rootland. There can be lots of debate on what that plant diversity is, but diversity of forage has had nothing but a positive impact on gut health anytime I've seen it. I was lucky to visit UCD research facility. I'll talk about that in the next slide, but I suppose this is the concept that we've been talking about, mixed species swards, and again, it's a significant change from the efficiency in our grazing systems we currently see. But I think it's a really important conversation to have, because if we look at maybe some of the bigger challenges that are there on water quality and biodiversity, well, I think an increased improving soil health actually will improve water quality. Improving root diversity and plant diversity will reduce nitrogen, which also positively impacts water quality. And if we think about our pyramid on the biodiversity scale, and we're feeding microbial life in soil, then mixed species swards are an absolute no-brainer going forward for the future of agriculture. So I think, you know, when you're presenting something like this, you've got to present ideas that are actually really tangible for people. And again, it's about really understanding the potential of diversity at a microbial level, and that diversity increasing up right throughout our food chain, and it only being a positive benefit. Anything I've looked at on mixed species swards from an animal output and profitability point of view make complete sense. I was lucky to visit Professor Tommy Boland about 2 weeks ago in UCD, and he was kind enough to bring me around to the farm because he knew I had an interest in this area, and we had a great discussion. And Tommy is a real scientist, and he's collecting the data to really showcase the potential. And he also talks about the issues with mixed species swards. But when we look at the positives around UCD research, animal performance reduces days to slaughter by 35 days. You know, if we think about parasites, and I had parasites in my iceberg diseases, a reduction in dosing for parasites by 50% in their lambs on the studies comparing perennials and mixed species swards. Really, really interesting, because parasites are a challenge that's increasing, and we know in our ecological systems, remember the dung beetle, some of our anti-parasiticides have a negative impact there. So we need to look at new ways of managing soil, grazing, and parasite control. Again, soil biology. I thought this was really interesting to look at the increase in worms per hectare between species over the number of years that they've been doing the trial. And again, if we think about worms as a biological indicator species, that's powerful. Water quality is very clear that the early indicators are positive and these are to be confirmed. But the reduction of nitrogen is quite huge. It's, if we look at kilos per hectare a year, the mixed species swards versus conventional. Again, drought resistance. So droughts is something now we're becoming more familiar with, unfortunately. And this is, if you go back to Alan Savory's regenerative piece, it really is focusing in on root diversity and building soil and drought resilience. But this is something we can adopt in more commercial settings. If we look at the next decade, what would it look like? I'm very aware that farmers are going to argue that the persistency issues are a challenge, and that's why research is ongoing. But we need to be mindful that everything here is pretty positive, and the persistency issues and oversowing and stitching in can potentially help there. And we can look at the different species as well. I think UCD research facility is a must visit for farming discussion groups to go and challenge your thinking around seeing what they're doing, and ask them the hard questions around persistency. But I think also recognizing that I think it really could be the future potential for grazing livestock, particularly when I look at soil health, root diversity, microbial life. I think it's the beginning of where we need to go biologically, and fair play to all the UCD team and for having me along. So summer scour syndrome, this is targeted at a farming audience that it's something I've been talking about for a long time. And I've looked at all the areas, and I think biological feeding and the gut microbiome have a potential role when we see these calves going out to grass. And it's really a grass-based issue. Okay, we rule out worms and coccidiosis and our common things. We see these calves falling away with almost like an acidosis type symptoms. Some of them will have ulcers, etc. There's been lots of talk about stress and disease being a factor. But when I look at summer scour syndrome, I didn't see it when I qualified first, and I've seen it massively increase. And maybe I'm in a way, I get to travel up and down the country and meet lots of farmers and discussion groups. I'm definitely seeing it on the increase. And if I think about what I've learned, particularly over the last 18 to 24 months, that when I think about calves coming from being weaned to go out onto grass and the change in the constituents of grass, particularly the lack of fibre and high oil contents of grass, well, it puts a huge challenge on the rumen and hindgut health of calves. And I'm increasingly beginning to believe that this is actually, and I'll talk about it again, and you're going to say, wow, he's talked about a lot, we're nearly an hour in, on leaky gut. And I think for summer scour syndrome, diversity of plants and different grazing strategies could alleviate this. But it does look again at the monoculture type system and the impact it has on gut health. And are conditions like this showing us early indications that we need to take a long look at what we're doing and see what the shift might be in the next decade. And I'm very aware from a farming perspective, and this is a real challenge, that monocultures have created fantastic efficiency and we've done a really good job there. But like all efficiencies, we need to look at it from a ecosystem perspective, and I think now is the time to start really having those conversations. Also, the challenge with mixed species swards and other grazing systems, as they can be perceived, and maybe rightly so, as more intensive or difficult to manage. And we see the challenges on farm that, okay, everyone wants to talk about farming, like maybe me today, but who's actually going to go and do all this farming? So we need to see why farming is always looking for efficiency and simplistic systems, because it helps make life a little bit easier, and who doesn't want that? But I think if we look at the positive benefits on mixed species swards, there's a real strong argument for them being a key component in the future. So if we look at manipulating the gut microbiome, then I think we can do it through diet. I think we need to really be opening our mind to mixed species swards. I think if we think about fiber's role, particularly from a ruminant and maybe a human perspective as well, I think it's really, really important to understand fiber's role in a healthy digestive system. And biological optimization, like I said, reducing stress is really important. And direct fed microbials then also have a role to play in farming systems. So this is the idea of the sponges again. How could direct fed microbials play a role? And this is where I've been absolutely fascinated. I hope we're 54 minutes in now that people can get a grasp, but I'm really interested in looking at the whole system. I try and think about science as much as I can and research things as well as I can. And I was a skeptic of direct-fed microbials, but I actually, from what I've seen the last 18-24 months, I think they're going to be a key component or tool in the system. So just to understand maybe direct-fed microbials or probiotics, maybe people will have heard me talk about, to understand their potential. Again, through metabolomics, we're getting a better understanding of what's happening. So when we talk about prebiotics, they're essentially the feed for good bacteria, and we've used them extensively. And actually, if you think about the most important prebiotic for maintenance of gut health in humans and animals, is probably fiber. That's why we want a diversity of fiber and diversity of plants in our diets and a balanced human diet. I think I could, whether people want to go all plant or not, I would disagree with that. I think a balanced diet is something from the research that I've read, but there is a real need for plants in our diet to produce fiber, that have fiber in them, that help maintain a healthy gut microbiome in ourselves. We think about probiotic bacteria. These are like factories, so the good beneficial bacteria, and how we use them. But remembering, actually, what was really interesting for me is it's actually the bacteria are like factories. We can feed them and manipulate the population with prebiotics, but when we're using probiotic bacteria, it's actually the metabolites they produce that act at a very cellular level that we call postbiotics. So people would have heard me talking about postbiotics for the last 12 months. And this is where the rubber meets the road, at a very cellular level. So postbiotics are the metabolites that act at cell level that I'll explain as I go along. So just by way of definitions, prebiotics, probiotics, and postbiotics. It's really important. Postbiotics are the metabolites bacteria produce, and really it's kind of new nomenclature in this area, but it's really exciting. So when we look at direct-fed microbials' potential in the future, and this is the idea of biological solutions in the animal health or veterinary market, and potentially looking at the human market as well. If we traditionally look at why we're using probiotics, well, we're trying to take beneficial bacteria and we're trying to mimic what the bacteria are doing in the digestive system, which is improving digestive function, regulating immunity, and also competing with harmful pathogens. But one thing you see when you look at all the different research across species is inconsistent results. And I have to say that when I actually got involved in this area, I was incredibly skeptical. But I don't think in 20 years my mind has been blown more by anything else other than these potential role of microbes. And the difference, that what we're doing differently, as I'll explain, and why that potential is absolutely massive. And I've seen incredible differences across species. So when we look at direct-fed microbials and probiotics, we think about all the bacterial species we can use. We think about bacteria that are potentially licensed for that. But when we actually think about the postbiotics that bacteria produce, they're a much narrower range, and they're actually what act at cell level. So this becomes really important when we look at direct-fed microbials. The postbiotics that the bacteria produce are actually the functionality of the microbes. So this is huge. So when we think about formatting and thinking about the future of probiotics, I think as a company, Precision Microbes, that I'm involved with, I think we're changing the game, because we are using really focusing in on functionality and postbiotics. Again, when we think about the applications of probiotics, we can use them certainly, and we've seen that across species for animals with diarrhea, helping biological stabilization. But their more accurate or more applicable use is actually in long-term use. So that's what we're really promoting now. But when we think about it at a cellular level, what's happening, whether it's the stabilization of the gut on the left-hand side back to normal, or the maintenance of health in a healthy gut, it is the postbiotic metabolites that are actually doing it. Okay, it's the postbiotic metabolites that are key. So Precision Microbes, we're working with liquid, and I won't go into the detail of all the USPs and how they're cultured, but it's mind-blowing. But essentially we've got live bacteria in a dormant state with all their metabolites or postbiotics in the liquid. They're cultured using very unique culturing techniques. So when I was doing the trial work, that's how I initially became involved. All the farmers wanted to buy the product because they saw a difference in the speed of action, stabilizing the calf's gut. They saw the increase in appetite, all the different things. And equally so, I gave it to a number of vets to trial it back in February 21, early February 2021, and they all saw a difference. So while we have data around performance and antibiotic reduction, I've never worked with a product like this before across all the different species. where we're actually seeing such a result, and it's really game changing because we're looking at the postbiotics and understanding gut health versus, you know, if you're using probiotics in a freeze dried or powder format, we have to remember that these powdered bacteria are dehydrated. They have to activate and they have to go through their lag and log phase to produce metabolites, and if we've got diarrhea, you know, to me, this is the format that probiotics will be in the future. So again, we really have improved the delivery mechanism. We think about the potential role, it's huge. I think these are a must try, and I'm not going to oversell the products today. Just go to our website, www.precisionmicrobes.com, because our customers are probably our best people to talk about our products, not me. Okay, so just if we think about postbiotics in different areas, it's actually the metabolites the bacteria produce. So if we look in the gut, they improve digestive health, improving feed conversion efficiency, supporting immune health, and protection against pathogens. So the competition, like the likes of entericins and bactericins, to compete with harmful pathogens. So we're innovating with biological solutions. Go to the website, have a look at what we're doing, because I am in no doubt it's game changing on what Precision Microbes is doing, and it's completely altered my thinking as well. Okay, so postbiotics, the potential in the gut, the potential in the mammary gland, there's lots of evidence there, but there's still tools. We still need to be brilliant at the basics, and I hope that concept came through in my biological optimization piece. Really, really important tools, but you know, we need to do the basics right in animal agriculture in our different systems. Just a little bit again on digestive transit time and why postbiotics are so important. So if we've got transit time that's increased, and we think about the value of active postbiotics going into the gut for stabilization, it makes complete sense. Again, there's a huge value to rapid gut stabilization. There's lots of studies looking at this. This one actually looked at the more diverse the gut microbiome was, the better the response of recovery. And I think if you're a dairy farmer, I would strongly suggest that you try Precision Microbes calves in the long-term use for your calves this spring, because it is just a game changer. Okay, so when we talk about postbiotics, I often get this alternative versus essential piece. So I get positioned into the alternative medicine space. But two postbiotics people will know, the mold that changed modern medicine was penicillin rubens, and actually penicillin was a metabolite of that. And also, I suppose we have to, at this particular time, recognize the impact that antibiotics are having on the gut microbiome and their potential increase in chronic disease and the change of diversity in the gut microbiome of developed countries. Because yes, antibiotics have a role to play, and they're very important tools again, but we don't want to overuse them because they can have an impact on the gut microbiome. Here's another postbiotic that people will know. It was discovered by Satoshi Omuro, a Japanese scientist, who discovered Streptomyces I can't even pronounce it, avermilitis. That bacteria produced a metabolite that later became known as ivermectin. So what's happening now is, through metabolomics, we have a much better understanding of how nature is working. And if we think about where nature has been and where we are in that timeline, well, it's important to recognize that it's developed some very unique tools. So if we can harness them, I think that's a huge opportunity for the future. So the perfect direct-fed microbial is in long-term usage. So we've seen that with our calf products. I've got to the stage now, I stayed quiet for 6 months of research, where everybody wanted to buy it and the results were fascinating, and then we put it on the ground for 6 months into vet practices here in Ireland, and the feedback was extremely positive from both farmers and vets by a majority. And then I've slowly built confidence that, yeah, you know, I'm willing to take egg on my face that this is, if I'm wrong, but these are game changers in gut health. Again, microbes have many functions, many microbes we can use, but many functions. So it's about the postbiotics, and the future will be blends of microbes with different functions that are targeted to digestive health, immunity, and competition. They need to get past the stomach. The postbiotics need to be there. The efficacy, we've got to use it. So people will talk about the number of bacteria per mil, colony forming units, and how many million you can have. But if they don't get to where they need to go in the best format, well, then that's irrelevant, I think. So, just a little bit from a farming perspective as well, other work we've been doing, Cryptosporidium. So here's some Cryptosporidium oocysts who we've actually worked on our next phase on our advanced gut stabilizers for calves and other species. Really fascinating science again. But what was interesting on Cryptosporidium is that it's actually in cows, in slurry, in calf pens, in calves. So when we were looking at that, I think we're going to need an all-farm approach. Another conversation for another day. Again, I just want to take it back to the gut, and we look at inflammation, because I think this is really important. Throughout this, if we look at chronic disease in humans, and we look at inflammation, we look at the immune systems in our digestive tract, it's a really interesting area to look at. If you look at the work by, and I've read it recently, by Professor Lance Baumgard, Trevisi's work from Italy, and they're looking at metabolic disease in cows. Ketosis and milk fever might be secondary to inflammation. That inflammation is the primary driver. Now, every mammal, when they go through a birthing process, has inflammation, but excessive inflammation leads to dry matter reduction. And where I want to talk about this from a context of some of the other conditions I put up on the screen was hindgut inflammation in the cows. We all know about the rumen, but hindgut inflammation in the cow may be a really interesting area to look at. And if you think about hindgut inflammation or leaky gut, that's probably relevant for our calves at grass as well, because they're developed the rumen, and we need to look at the hindgut in our grazing animals and some of the conditions we're seeing. So if we look at SARA, subacute ruminal acidosis, milk fever, unexplained early embryonic deaths, coughing cows, I won't go into them in detail, but again, inflammation and leaky gut in humans, if we look at the research, is overactivation of the immune system and all the challenges that are there. Now, one of the conditions that I've come across quite a bit in the last while is coccidiosis, a parasite in adult cattle at 18 months old and going into finishing. And I've never seen that before. Okay, we can see in immuno-naive younger animals why that would be a challenge, but why is that now a huge challenge in older cattle? To me, and I'm postulating here, but it's giving evidence again of hindgut inflammation. If we look at Van Bangard and Trevisi's work, they were looking at bypass starches and its impact on hindgut inflammation. But if we look at leaky gut, I think it's an area of potential research over the next decade. Again, looking at what happens with leaky gut is, again, just like we said, there's a layer of cells between the digesta and the wall of the lumen immune system. If we have inflammation in here, well, then it can cause overactivation of our immune system. Remember, 70% of the immune system is in the gut. Well, then it's an area of real interest in humans and animal medicine. So chronic inflammation, could it be linked back to soil health? Could it be linked back to animal health and the plant health that the plants were producing? And if we certainly look at leaky gut and chronic inflammation, if we look at the diet that we're consuming, particularly ultra-processed foods, what role is there? So leaky gut, an interesting space across all species, I would say. Okay, if we think about the context then of maybe what I was talking about, summer scar syndrome and some of the diseases that potentially will be looking at leaky gut, if we look at one of the challenges around our monocultures and perennial ryegrasses, certainly I would have issues with seeing the work that I've been doing on minerals declining, but lack of fiber is a big one. If we think about fiber as a prebiotic, if we're to use no supplements, they're low in sodium, they're high in sugar, higher in nitrogen, and quite high in conjugated linoleic acids, which are oils. And I think if we look at some of the constituents there and we think about leaky gut and inflammation, particularly summer scar syndrome, and I look at some of the solutions that we've had, be it strip grazing, putting cows into rougher pasture, using microbes as a treatment to help recovery, but I think the question needs to be asked, that is this a highly contributing factor to some of the summer scar syndrome and some of the other conditions we're seeing in calves and livestock. And that's challenging the status quo today, it's challenging the narrative, but if we don't have these conversations, we can't adapt and change. And I think it's an important conversation to have for the future of our grazing systems, particularly then when you look at root structure and soil biology and the future of farming as well. So, reviewing some of the icebergs, summer scar syndrome, cows eating stones, CCN, which is a B1 deficiency, the only vitamin actually synthesized in the rumen. It's really showcasing, if we're seeing an increase in that, a decline in rumen health. Parasites, again, we're seeing more and more worm issues. And again, if we think about our current grazing strategies, a really, really good, world-renowned parasitologist said to me at a discussion about 7 years ago, he said, think about it logically, about monocultures in your grazing system and weather patterns. We're playing into the parasite's hands, so we need to think differently. I think if we look at inflammation in the gut, it's an area of real interest in research. And if we look at mineral deficiencies through monocultures, not just grasses for animals, but actually if we think about monoculture cropping for plant-based foods and done at scale, well, are we really harnessing all the minerals we can from soil and optimizing soil health? And then from a plant health perspective and a human health perspective, is there an opportunity to look at these? So just, I suppose, putting some ideas there. They're my own ideas, research from other people, putting it together, and asking the question, why are we seeing some of these iceberg diseases? Inflammation is key. It's one of the things, if you look across human and animal health, particularly chronic diseases, inflammation and gut health are integral to that. Okay, some other areas for postbiotic metabolites that are really exciting is the mammary gland, the respiratory system, and remembering we have microbiota in our skin, our lungs, our airways, and they're playing a real protective effect. And if we think about the mammary gland, equally so. So I think we'll see more and more of these biological approaches and biological solutions in the animal health market as well. It's a really exciting area. Just to mention on farm, it's quite a long presentation, I know, so you can imagine how much information I jammed into 35 minutes over the weekend, and apologies to the audience for doing that, but I had to get it all out of my system. So today is a much more, I suppose, a slower version, but still lots of information about understanding biomes and the microbiome and soil, animal and human health. But the water biome is a really important one on farm. This is an oxygen meter where we just look at oxygen levels in water, looking at flow rates, and I do a lot of cultures just to really show farmers again that the water that animals drink going into their young calves, maybe adult ruminants, and we see it in intensive systems as well, is a really important component of the biome and the structure of our farm system, and we need to get that right. We can use biologicals through water, we can use different chemicals that aren't harmful, like hydrogen peroxide, H2O2. That oxygen free radical can be incredibly powerful. So there's lots of things we can do with water, simple things, having plenty of it there, etc. But it's an important biome. An interesting biome as well, the environmental biome. So we always think about chemicals, ultra sterilization of the environment. But I think beneficial microbes have a potential role to play. So we see microbes being fogged into the environment here. If we think about the farming environment like a petri dish, we can actually control the beneficial microbes going in there. And it's probably worth also saying, I suppose, the hygiene hypothesis as well. I'm not sure how relevant it is in animal agriculture, but in human agriculture, or human health, if we think about our immune systems and the need for actually exposure, that it's a memory system, that maybe ultra sterilization isn't a good idea, that we want to avoid harmful pathogens, but pathogens also, or bacteria and different viruses, will actually stimulate that immune system, which helps it develop, which is a real challenge probably in our current climate. But environmental biomes, I'm sort of getting sidetracked there. Environmental biomes, really important, and a potential area for the use of microbes and new ways of thinking. So if I go back to my original title, I think it was Biological Approaches to Modern Agriculture and Veterinary. So that's why I'm bringing some of these in, but trying to put them in perspective of the overall system. Okay, I know this is a long video, but just I think you have to put all the pieces, I have to try and put some pieces of the jigsaw together. And then if we start looking at the bigger picture around maybe cows and climate change, I think that's really important, because I've been slightly frustrated for the last 12 months on some of the conversations on the need to remove animal agriculture potentially as the solution to global warming. And every industry has an impact on global warming, and cattle are no different. But if you look at the potential of biological optimization, if you look at the role of ruminants in soil health, if you look at animal protein as a key nutrient or macronutrient in animal health, well then it makes a lot of sense that we need to really look at what we're doing around cows and climate change, and making sure everybody understands the challenges, but also the realities of the importance of animal agriculture, in my opinion. Okay, so when we look at cows and methane, there's been a huge amount of discussions there. We know in Ireland at a national level there's a need to reduce our global warming impact, and we have climate targets, and methane is a significant has significant warming potential. But it is a very different gas, and this can lead to a lot of confusion. And there's even different sources of methane when we actually look at potential sources of methane. But when we look at warming potential, we know that fossil fuels, I think no one can argue that fossil fuels are taking something, carbon from the ground, and emitting it and causing significant warming potential. And it's a one-way street. And methane is different. Biogenic methane from cattle is different. It's a shorter half-life. It's broken down by hydroxylation to CO2 over 10 to 12 years. And it is part of that carbon recycling if you think about plants and you think about how the photosynthesis actually works. So cows are part of a cycle. And that's a very strong argument for methane and why we need to think about it differently and its warming potential. So you can see that there's an argument for advanced cooling by reducing cow numbers and hitting our emission targets. But at what cost if we think about cows and maybe an animal protein and the quality of protein we can produce in grazing systems? I think we need to be just really careful about this conversation. I think actually methane is a little bit of a sideshow for some of maybe the bigger challenges that biological optimization will help with. But we have to be mindful that if we increase cow numbers and we look at GWP star even, that we are increasing warming potential over a period of time. I think it gets really interesting when you look at, okay, removing cows from the environment completely, and we think about small farms globally and the role of cows potentially in the likes of the regenerative work the Savory Institute do. It's absolute madness, actually, some of the debate around cows. I think we need to be careful with the biogenic methane cycle. It can be used for and against, so we just need to understand it. But I think mitigation strategies are something that have been muted, and I think there is an opportunity, yes, to mitigate methane. So if we go back again to the methane and the microbiome, if we think about where methane actually comes from, well, these rumen metagenic archaea take CO2 and H2 and they produce CH4, which is methane, which is released, and it's a normal process. There's a huge amount of research going into this current pathway, locking up methane, but I think the future will be, and I'm really interested in this space, is what we can do to take up that CO2, H2, look at those rumen metagenic bacteria and actually improve gut health. The more I learn about gut health, and particularly hind gut health even, we focus on rumen and methane, we can actually use mitigation strategies that are actually going to, okay, take up excess CO2 and H2, but also that might actually influence hind gut health and reduce inflammation in our cows. So I'd be actually quite excited about the methane space in that we can do a lot in that space. So, and it's not to be dismissive, but it can be a little bit of, it seems to be the all-encompassing argument, but I think it's a bit of a sideshow. Yes, it's a challenge, absolutely, but we need to look at the whole picture in relation to animal protein, grazing livestock, and the quality of products we produce, but also all the social and socio-economic stability and sustainability issues in rural communities. When we look at warming potential, we know this is different, and this is oversimplification, but we know that the different gases will have different warming potential. And if you look at like a duvet and the TOG values, CO2 has a different value to methane, which is much, could be 26, 28, and nitrous oxide is over a 200 warming potential versus CO2. So that's important when you look at the different gases and we look at half-lives of CO2 and nitrous oxide being much longer, and particularly biogenic methane being in a cycle. So all these gases are extremely important if we want to take climate change very seriously, as we should. But if we then bring in livestock and we bring in soil health, and we actually even look, and won't go into today, but if we look at optimal soil health and the metanotrophs that are potentially in soil that we can actually if we look at soil, it's the ability to build carbon through varying root lengths and actually building soil, being part of a sequestration process within agriculture. There's very few industries aside from agriculture that can do that. So how we graze cows becomes very, very important. I think we have to be mindful of numbers. But if we can do it in a way that's in promoting soil health, like I've described throughout the video so far, looking at the herbage that is going to actually improve animal performance, looking at some mitigation strategies of methane, well, I think it's a win-win. And if we look at mixed species swards, the reduction in nitrous oxide that we're producing, or the reduction in fertilizer, I think that's huge. I think that's a massive one. I think nitrous oxide sometimes gets missed. Everyone's focusing on methane. And I think fertilizer is the big one. Now, there's significant challenges of going from A to B and removing fertilizer completely, but I think it's something we need to be really focused in on, in actually how we can optimize biology in soil with diversity of plants, with ruminants in a cyclical manner, and we can actually reduce nitrogen over time. And it is this concept of we overestimate what we can do in a year and people want to do it now versus what we underestimate in a decade, and that's where we need to really focus in, is more on nitrous oxide. And I think it's very interesting when you look at the solutions for climate change and agriculture. And it's this idea of a plant-based future. And if we think about, and I've been quite, I suppose, maybe hard on monocultures from a grazing cow perspective and a health perspective of soils, but monocultures for plant-based diets is no different. I mean, we mass produce monoculture type crops that have an equally big impact on soil health. And if we look at our sponges, again, monocultures, be it in any format, are going to impact soil health. And I think if we look at fertilizer dependency, it's equally as big in cropping as it is in animal agriculture. So there's a real argument there that, okay, it's not really the cow, it's how we do it. And I think that's what the likes of Alan Savory and the regenerative principles talk about. And there is a healthy sponge, that carbon building, that soil building, that drought resistance, that we can really look at our grazing strategies and have cows and other ruminants in that ecosystem. Yes, they're producing methane, but if we can do it by the reduction of fertilizer with the overall role of high quality animal protein in the human diet, I think that's where the focus needs to be. And I don't think sometimes the simplistic argument that if we go plant-based, yes, there is potential savings from an environmental impact perspective, but it's not always as straightforward when you look a little bit deeper. I think the plant-based world, certainly we all need to look, it's about balance. I mean, this conversation is about balance. We all need to eat more whole foods versus ultra-processed foods. And we do need plant diversity in our diet. And plant diversity in cropping systems, and again, I've watched regenerative tillage farmers and looking at what they're doing. Again, keeping roots in the ground, again, improving soil health, improving the quality of plants that are produced. And a recognition is always a trade-off, but I think the plant-based world is often oversimplified, and cheap food is a challenge. I mean, that is one of our great challenges. But then if I look at developing countries and I think about this whole plant-based argument and how important livestock production is there, we need to work more and more with the principles of regenerative agriculture, because we can really change communities and help with some of the massive challenges of global warming impact that's occurring right now. It's a little bit far away from us now, even though we definitely can see elements of it affecting us, but nothing like the catastrophes that are occurring in developing countries in places like Africa, where this type of regenerative approach with agriculture in an ecological system has such a potential impact. So I think the plant-based argument, particularly where you're producing monocultures, and then when you're producing ultra-processed monoculture blends together, I don't think it's the answer to human health and human nutrition or planetary health that maybe it's sometimes in a very simplistic manner given to us. So if we look at our opportunities, I think monocultures are something we need to move away from, be it in grazing livestock. And if we look at even from a tillage perspective, it is a challenge. And again, it's an area outside my expertise, but that's been we have to realize that post World War II, we've driven efficiency and we've driven production to meet global demands, and that's why maybe we need to focus more on food waste. But from a soil point of view, if we can work with ruminant livestock in a grazing structure where we have root diversity, we are creating high quality animal proteins. I think it's a very important opportunity, and it's the sponge on the right hand side. And it's worth remembering that people talk about trees and rewilding and everything like that, that actually when we look at grasses and different grasses biomass, it's below the ground, so there's potential for carbon sequestration, potential for, I suppose, mitigation against drought resistance, and even water quality. There is a lot to be said for grazing systems and the potential for grass as a biomass, and when it's utilized correctly. Okay, so biodiversity, I think this is a big challenge. We have to recognize that. And I come at this from not a vet or anything else. I come at probably from as a father of 5 kids, looking at biodiversity and what we can do in the future, and realizing that our ecosystems, for me, that was a eureka moment when microbial life at a very foundational level of soil, the likes of our indicator species like worms and dung beetles, that these are all telling us about biodiversity and part of a chain. And there's a huge opportunity here when we look at biodiversity to actually increase the diversity of plants, and that increases the soil microbiome. It's well recognized with ecological principles that ruminants have been part of that for millennia. We can absolutely look at what nature's doing, being mindful in modern agriculture there is some challenges, and that we are speeding up those processes, but being mindful that ruminants actually play a key role in soil biology. And we can build soil organic matter, actually help with diversity with proper grazing management. So it is a win-win when I look at biodiversity and biological principles and approaches. So hopefully, after a very long video, I've made some significant reasons why biological approaches are to be looked at, improving soil health, improving animal health, and I think we need to look at soil health and its link with human health, and I'll talk a little bit about that to finish up. But if we look at some of the big challenges around water quality, biodiversity and social license, which is our right to farm, if we can understand and explain and articulate and communicate these principles and where we're going, and recognizing we've achieved so much in agriculture, and now that we're shifting over the next decade, these are the principles we're adopting and bringing people with us. And I think that will be really, really, again, microbes for me has been like a eureka moment to the different uses of microbes. This trial work that I'm involved in across agriculture, across species, just been incredible. But looking at the format that we actually use them in, homoaffirmative silage, inoculants, microbes in the environment, I've seen some of the plant research, it's just fascinating. Not commercially relevant right now, but who knows when fertilizer is removed, if we can understand the principles of how biology works, how we can even harness more of that for types of foliar applications, etc. So huge potential here, and I probably have a little bit overexcited about that, but it's massive. So if we look at a focus on human and planetary health, then we're in a very synergistic relationship with our ecosystems. And with big challenges, we need dialogue. And I absolutely deplore this system versus that system. You know, I'm always trying to learn from people. That's how I've got to this point in my career. I've challenged my thinking. I've gone and listened to people who have different thoughts to me that are proving have good scientific points, and I weigh them up with my own, and that's how we get better. And asking questions, and I mean, I might come across as quite critical of monocultures, and that's fair enough, but I've asked the questions, why am I seeing what I'm seeing? And I've been waiting long enough to say, well, I've come to the point that I can no longer say that this is the future of where we need to go. And if we look at the next decade in food production, it's the most important. We're seeing the significant rise in global population. We're seeing how we're going to marry that with global warming and feeding a population and keeping socioeconomic stability, not just in developed countries, but developing countries as well. We need absolutely every tool, every smart person available, everything, every piece of technology. We still need chemistry, and we need to be smart about it and collectively working together. And I just have so little time for sort of ideologies that are sort of divisive and polarizing. I want to work in the middle with people who are focused on solutions and who are able to have conversations, who will critique me properly as well and say, well, some of your ideas are good, but this is why they won't work. And I'll listen to that. But a focus in human and planetary health starts with, I think, agriculture at the foundation of it. So if we look at farming and human health, and we look at where human health actually is, and we've come out of a global pandemic. But if we look at, I was reading last week on 5% of GDP in America was spent on healthcare in 1960. It's now nearly up to 20% of gross domestic product is spent on healthcare. A lot of focus on treatments and cures. There's a pill for everything. Let food be thy medicine. I think if we think about diet and we think about health and we think about how all this links together, for me, it makes a huge amount of sense. And we must value farming as well. There's, like every business, it's an economic level to it, and the social sustainability of rural communities, but actually farming as part of planetary health. And we've got to value every link in the chain, because if we look at demographics of farmers globally and labour shortages, we want to be careful what we wish for in relation to having people actually working to produce our food, and we're very, very lucky. The animals within the ecosystem, I can understand why people simply don't want to eat animal protein from a point of view of it goes against what they want to do, and that's fine. But those of us who do consume animal protein have to value it, not just nutritionally, but the animals that go into it. There are ecosystems that actually are producing it, supplying and work, and that's sort of at odds with cheap food. So we do need to look at the price of food, and then we need to look at the disparities within countries and people and populations and communities where that's a real challenge. So it's a big complex story. But it's really interesting at a base level to look at soil health and human health, because I actually think the more I learn, if you want to bring it through from the microbial story, they're inextricably linked. So people will ask, where's our food supply chain now? And I think there's no doubt that it's you know, is synthetic biology, someone said to me the future is either synthetic biology, plant-based, or regenerative agriculture, and they could be right. But if we look at synthetic biology, why not optimize the biology we have at the moment? And if I look at global food production, ultra processing seems to be the order of the day. Multi-processed food, we need to eat more whole foods. And I think if you look at the plant-based movement and the plant-based burgers, if you actually look at the ingredients within some of these, like carboxymethyl cellulose, P60, they're actually having a detrimental effect on that gut microbiome I was talking about. And I think if we look at ultra-processed foods, they're at the root of a lot of challenges. And then we have ideologies where, you know, pouring milk is a statement for saving the planet, where people are starving. I think we must recognize there's always going to be ideologies. We need to meet in the middle and try and have reasonable conversations. I mean, I don't buy into this extremism in any shape or form. But yeah, we can do a lot better. We have done a lot well. So I hope I've made an argument for really understanding maybe biological principles and where that fits in. Because if you look at metabolic health globally, we have a significant challenge. You compare 1950s to 2020, and I found no evidence that meat consumption or animal protein consumption are actually at the root cause of this. So I think if you look at a lot of it, it is around ultra processing food. There's lots of different lifestyle choices and everything like that we have. But if you look at the global pandemic and you look at the role of comorbidities in the incidence of people succumbing to COVID-19, I think to me it was a wake-up call around metabolic health in developing countries. And also, I think we have the challenge of food poverty increasing, driven more by wars. And we must remember that globally, 75% of farms are still less than a hectare. And this is an old figure now, that 800 million people go to bed hungry a night. It's increasing because of economic conditions globally. And that's 9 million plus people a year die of hunger. And that's a person every 4 seconds. So I'm talking for an hour and a half. And that's a frightening statistic of how many thousand people have died, could potentially have died of hunger, most of them children. So we need to be a little bit more careful about potentially looking at demonizing animal agriculture, because from a food poverty perspective, where we look where climate change is ravaging communities and people, that actually animal agriculture has a real potential, particularly regenerative agriculture, role to play in building carbon, providing healthy food for people. And I think we need to be very careful about our debates around animal agriculture in developing countries, but also in our current societies. We've got to ask about human health, and we've got to look at how much food we waste, the production of food, and the value in highly nutritious, highly dense food. So I can find no evidence to suggest that our obesity or our metabolic health issues are being driven by animal protein or fats. And every food is an environmental cost. But we must, when we're talking about environmental costs of food, we must look at nutrient density. I don't think animal protein is the problem, and I increasingly think that will come to light. And there's new science looking at actual animal protein. Protein in general is how important as a macronutrient it is. I think it's the how, not the cow. Okay, we talk a lot about methane, but there are certain things maybe I would see that we need to focus on in the next decade that will be more sustainable in our production systems, and the value of that cow, other ruminants in that, I think that's really important. And again, if I go back to an earlier slide and we can look at, you know, where our gut microbiomes have gone, and I think if we look at the big challenges now facing human health are chronic disease. We've got better at controlling infectious diseases. By and large, there's still a challenge in some countries and some parts of the world, but our big problem now is chronic disease, and that will come to light over the next decade and future decades if we don't look at it. There's number of factors involved: diet, stress, toxins, environment, and lifestyle. I've read extensively on this, and it's very hard to get consensus on diet, but what I would say on the human diet is, yes, we need plants, we need diversity, we need whole foods, but we also need high quality proteins, which animal proteins are, as part of a balanced diet and hopefully a balanced debate. Diversity, we've got to worry about the desertification, and if we just think about grazing livestock in the diversity of swards and the regenerative type movement in developing countries, how important that conversation is and where we need to support it more and more. In maybe countries like Ireland, we need to look at the principles that are involved in it and look at where we currently are and how we can adopt more of them over the next decade. There's the science, there's the will, there's the people. I think there's a real understanding within agriculture and within farmers themselves and an interest in this particular area. So it's a choice on the sponges we want. Dietary health sponges, the soil sponges, the animal sponges. I think trying to maybe oversimplify the idea, but it's really important. I think it's a choice we need to make. And for what I've learned over the last number of years, in particular last 2 years, it is back to understanding the biological principles, harnessing the power of nature. We can actually use scientific advancements to further that even, and I've seen that from a gut health perspective by understanding how microbes work and how we can utilize organic biological solutions for better animal health performance. So I think when you lift the biological lid, you can't put it back down, and I have lifted the lid and I've learned a little bit, and this presentation has been the ideas of a lot of other people I've been listening to and trying to pull them together from an overview of the system. But it's absolutely fascinating, and I think we ignore biology at our peril for the next decade if we do choose to ignore it. So communication is key, and I think that's absolutely key. And I think it's about avoiding stress gaps and accepting that when we produce food, there's an environmental impact, but there's always trade-offs and we can always improve. We need to look at the more we stress biologically herds and flocks, the more challenges we get. The realization that farmers are an aging demographic, they're not in abundance, it's a hard job, and the negativity they often endure is quite hard to listen to. So we don't want to create stress gaps for people who actually produce our food. For industry as well, we need to be looking at our messaging and being honest about what the future is and what the challenges are, and being upfront with the consumer, because a stress gap between what we say and what we do creates challenges that inevitably always come out. And I think communication is key, and all debate is now polarized. So the popularity of people pouring the milk on the floors of supermarkets, that's great. It's vocal minorities, and unfortunately we don't have long form conversations anymore, and that's why I'm a particular fan of podcasts, because I've listened to a lot of people in different areas that I've talked about today from podcasts, because you get a real in-depth understanding of complex issues, and we cannot have really in-depth understanding of agricultural food systems by short sound bites, and I think that's what we've been certainly exposed to for the last 12 months. But please don't forget the silent majority. Most people understand, and most people have a lot of common sense around food production and how we produce food, and I think that's a really important message as well around communication. I've sort of gone around the house and covered many topics in this long video. Can you imagine sitting through this 35-minute version of this? But it's really important for me to get some of these ideas out there. And what's most important to me as a flawed human being is somebody who's always willing to change, is this idea of progress over perfection. The ideal of perfection is always unattainable at a personal level, and it probably is in any system that we work with, but this idea of progress is really important. So the idea that we can pivot now, look at what we've achieved and what we need to do next, this idea of 1% rule. I don't like system bashings. Different agricultural systems, this is why it's better. In reality, we'll probably need synthetic biology, we'll need hydroponics, we'll need all sorts of technology, we'll need grazing livestock, we'll need intensive livestock production, we'll need it all, and we can learn lessons from each other as well. And it's a big market out there, we can all produce food for people. And then as consumers, I think we need to look at what we eat, and particularly wasting food, particularly when we understand creating the value around how it's produced. In complex systems, there's many actors, and food systems are no different. Collective approaches and collaboration work. And I think the biggest win is if we start understanding the importance of soil health in food systems for a better society. And it's big picture thinking, but it's coming to the fore. More and more people are talking about it. And again, it comes back to leadership, and I often say that the solutions queue is short. It's a much better queue to be in. Everyone's telling us about the challenges, but leadership's really important. It's something I won't go into too much because I've covered enough, but it's really important that we show leadership now within agriculture and step up, because that's the opportunity. I think society is waiting for that type of leadership, and the opportunities by biological principles are just only on a positive benefit for everyone in the supply chain if it's managed correctly. So the future of farming is that link between human health and animal agriculture. I think if we look at animal protein, it's an incredibly important macronutrient. And I went down the rabbit hole of human diets and looked at all the different diets. And I think it's about balance. And as we understand metabolomics, as I spoke about earlier, better, even the things we will get from grazing livestock in regenerative type pasture systems that will come through to the meat that's consumed. And if we look at actually all the macronutrients that are in meat, I think it's an incredibly nutrient dense part of the human diet. If we look at some of our challenges at a global level, skeletal development in children, if we think about sarcopenia and aging, and look at muscle, look at the work of Dr. Gabrielle Lyons, who talks about muscle as the longevity organ in our body and how important protein, and particularly animal protein, is. Again, you can get your protein from whatever source you want, but understanding that those of us who choose to consume animal protein are making a very good decision around our health and nutrition, because it's an important macro element. Now that argument around nutrition is a massive one and is full of rabbit holes if you choose to go down it. But after going down and up the rabbit holes, I do believe that animal protein is such an incredibly important part or macronutrient of the human diet. The future is bright. I came under 2 hours, which is good. If anyone's still listening to me, thank you for sticking with me with so many ideas and probably meandering, but hopefully some of the key messages that optimizing biology and farming systems works, that it's a journey and all change is slow, and we underestimate what we can do in a decade and overestimate in a year. Some people want to change quicker, but I think we need to start having these conversations, bringing these ideas out, articulating them, putting more and more science to them. And I heard it, and it's been said many times, that we can fix a lot of chronic disease in humans with soil. By starting in soil, and look at that microbial pyramid. And we do still need chemistry, technology, and all the tools available to us. But agriculture is a very exciting space, I have to say. I've outlaid some of where I think the massive opportunities are, some of the current challenges, and the way we're going to have to change around systems thinking. Who knows who's listened to me, who stayed with me for this length of time? If you have, I'm glad you have. The challenge, of course, is when you put out these messages, which I probably will do in social media, you get it's democratized opinion, you get all mixtures of opinion. I want to work with people who are willing to have good debate, communication, and I think that's what we need to have more and more of, and understanding the value in communication, the value in thinking about science, and recognizing that nature is giving us some signals, and we need to recognize them and take appropriate action. Okay, thank you very much. That's the end of quite a long winding road on biological approaches to modern agriculture and veterinary, and I hopefully have made a point of why it's essential, not alternative.